Hello everybody. Whoa, so today we've got a really interesting topic lined up, which is candy flipping. So welcome back. We're going to be talking about candy flipping, and not only candy flipping, but actually optimizing the candy flipping experience. And then on top of that, what that tells us about mystical experiences, non-dual awareness, and how to optimize it even more, perhaps with other substances and practices, to the point where we could perhaps have some kind of world awakening project where we have figured out how to deliver this experience in such a reliable and healthy and wholesome way that Shulgin's quote unquote +4 becomes something you could do every day with no side effects. Well, that is a dream. That is a dream. Well, before I get into that, very quickly, the qualia of the day is vanilla. Vanilla scent in particular. This is actually natural vanilla oleo resin. I actually use it on a lot of compositions. One of them is Fearless, for example. Fearless, without vanilla, it wouldn't actually get tied together. You wouldn't get the proper blending and unification of the various facets. So vanilla is quite a beautiful thing, a quilly variety of scent that has so many applications. I mean, essentially it sweetens first and foremost. It sweetens. It makes things kind of more edible, more palatable. It unifies the facets and adds a little bit of reverb to the smell across the board. It is hard to find things that mix very badly with vanilla. Vanilla, if you kind of like make a matrix of what goes well with vanilla generally goes well with almost everything, with some exceptions. Now, there are, of course, compositions you can ruin by adding vanilla. For example, some very rich, deep, let's say like rose, watery compositions that have a kind of mystical depth. If you add a little bit of vanilla, it flattens it. It kind of like makes it lower dimensional. It adds some opacity to it. So it's not always good, but in general, adding a little bit of vanilla makes things more blended and united and pleasant. Actually, Royal Copenhagen, which I was talking about earlier as a quilly of the day for the video on UFOs and DMT entities, that one, once you realize it does have a very solid vanilla note at the center, and you focus on that, actually the composition makes sense. So I kind of retract the idea that there was no way to comprehend that scent. If you focus on the vanilla on Royal Copenhagen, it's actually a pretty nice scent. It's actually, I'm going to say it's pretty nice. Now, pure vanilla is, of course, very beautiful. Now, the metaphor to be used in here about vanilla is, oh, and look at this cool t-shirt I got at the the Science of Consciousness conference. Also, I will actually mention this t-shirt in a bit, because I think like this is not a terrible immediate representation of non-dual awareness as a state of being, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I will mention very, very quickly on vanilla that it is actually not the best unifier. It is reliable as a unifier, as a blender, but they're like best things. For example, like musks, galaxolide, ambroxan, isoe super. They're kind of like another level in their capacity to unite things. So for example, one experiment I did early on in my exploration for scent qualia, the state space of scents, was combining vanilla and pinene. Pinene in particular smells very, very sharp. You know, these very sharp kind of resinous pine qualia. When you mix it with vanilla in roughly equal proportions, you actually get this flicker effect where it's vanilla, pine, vanilla, pine, in kind of a Poisson distribution or a bimodal that goes from one to the other, flickers really quickly at random. If to that you add a musk, let's say galaxolide or habanolide, isoe super, any one of those, then actually you get a vanilla pine phase, a good blend that actually feels like one, and they're not battling each other. Okay, so the metaphor here is, I think of MDMA as kind of the vanilla of drugs in a certain way, right? Like for a lot of substances, you need to prepare, you need to be kind of like in your optimal self. I know people who wouldn't sit others for DMT because it's just too much of a, rolling the dice, too much of a gamble. It might be really unpleasant. Whereas MDMA, usually it doesn't go too bad. There is a percentage of people who react very poorly to MDMA, maybe for genetic reasons. There's people for whom MDMA is just straight up dysphoric. There's people for whom, MDMA represents a medical crisis right away. So it's, has mixed reviews. But let's say somewhere in, the ballpark of like 80-85% of people, if they take MDMA occasionally at reasonable doses, they're just going to have a good time. Right? It's a very generically, very highly valenced, holistic, well-rounded sense of well-being that it produces. Some kind of deep relaxation, especially in the realm of social cognition, where you don't have all of the priors inbuilt from a lifetime of trauma, a lifetime of conditioning, and you can essentially approach relationships anew. And see the good, positive possibilities that exist between you and others, or you and groups. So, I mean, in that sense, MDMA is kind of the vanilla, but it's also the vanilla of drugs in a different way, which is that it combines pretty well with a lot of things, save for very dangerous combinations. For example, do not ever combine MDMA and ayahuasca, for example. That could very easily kill you. And I'm not kidding, right? Like MAOIs and MDMA are very deadly, right? So I mean more in the sense of psychological safety. Taking a low dose of, I don't know, psilocybin and then mixing in a little bit of MDMA will make the psilocybin a lot less harsh or fearful, or it will kind of significantly, soften the feelings of doom that sometimes happen with psilocybin, or reduce the risk of a pretty unpleasant experience. But I think, nonetheless, there's something much more significant and profound that MDMA's interaction with psychedelics point to. And I really want to understand it and develop a sophisticated theory of what is going on so that we can optimize it. So, the first part of this talk essentially will be, how do we optimize first the study of candy flipping and then candy flipping proper? And then the second part is, how do we generalize it? Kind of a generalized conception of candy flipping. What is it about candy flipping that is different than just MDMA, different than just LSD? Like that synergy, what is special about it? What can we learn from it? And how can we generalize it to other combinations or other practices that might, in a very reliable way, induce powerful, blissful, non-dual awareness experiences that might change the course of history. Okay, so getting started. So for sure, MDMA is not something that you should take often. I think there's a case to be made that, once a year is already kind of like at the limit, just, out of an abundance of caution. MDMA is one of those things that, roughly speaking, I would say it is generally underdone in terms of how much benefit it could provide people. But the boundary between underdoing it and overdoing it is so thin that like just recommending people try MDMA is probably a net negative, because you will have a certain percentage of them, let's say 20% actually, and might end up taking it way more than is actually beneficial. I am actually pretty bullish on figuring out the kind of optimal therapeutic model, essentially, where the doses are very well controlled and there's no risk of dose escalation. Some people have the personality where if they have access to MDMA, they will just use it all. It's not as extreme as, let's say, with something like methamphetamine or something like that, but it does happen. I know a really brilliant person I highly respect that back in his early youth, would essentially take a gram of MDMA over a weekend. And I can't imagine, but the calm downs there and the after effects must be really, really horrible, extremely unpleasant. So I can't imagine how anybody would do that over and over again. But lo and behold, it does happen. So again, kind of has a dark side, absolutely. However, I do think, the price is very well worth pursuing, at least at the research level. Of course, before rolling it out, have to make sure that it's safe and effective. But yeah, I mean, trip reports of people having such a really powerfully positive candy flipping experience that on those years of trauma really is motivating, right? It's like, what is going on here? Why, why is the synergy so powerful and promising? Well, the first thing I will mention now is that science does not understand candy flipping. Very recently in the Lichten lab, there was a study. It was by current scientific standards for how to study psychedelics. It was very well done. Essentially, from the recruiting pipeline to the quality of the researchers, the labs, every method that they used is standard, first line of research methods, essentially using psychedelic questionnaires, phenomenological sampling, visual analog scales. They took blood samples throughout the experience. And essentially what they compared was MDMA, LSD, and MDMA with LSD. A very important caveat is that the combination was taken at the same time. And the doses were 100 milligrams of MDMA and 100 micrograms of LSD, although I believe their LSD ended up being a little bit weaker than that, like 90 micrograms or something like that. Well, first of all, they found no significant difference between the LSD experience and LSD with MDMA, at least in phenomenological scales, or at least the differences that they found, they didn't consider to be significant enough to essentially be reported in the conclusion as MDMA does this. Essentially, the conclusion says it is unlikely that MDMA will add any therapeutic value to LSD. Well, if you dig into the study, you will see, no, well, hold on a second. The way they did the data analysis wasn't actually all that smart. For example, they did find that MDMA plus LSD was more blissful than just LSD. But because MDMA has somewhat of a calm down, and then you look at, let's say, LSD plus MDMA at the 6-hour mark, then there they noticed a drop, essentially, in blissful feelings. Well, yeah, now if you average across the board, you might say, well, okay, blissful feelings are roughly the same. But no, hold on a second. Actually, there was like a very powerful difference right at the beginning, right? So there's like issues like that in the analysis that I found on the paper that are, like, yeah, kind of like mind-boggling. Like, you wouldn't really do that if if you have some acquaintance with the phenomenology, you would actually hone in your tools to study where the synergy is happening and really distinguish that moment of synergy relative to the overall experience and things like that. But the bigger complaint here is well, the doses are not exactly appropriate for kind of like really understand what ravers are raving about when they're talking about candy flipping, and also the way in which it's taken. So here's the thing: typical candy flipping experiences, there are two schools of thought. None of these schools of thoughts talk about taking MDMA and LSD at the same time. In general, when I have talked to very hardcore psychonauts, either in Phenomenology Club or even back in college, I used to have some friends who were really extreme psychonauts in various ways, and and I got some excellent data points from them, and just having a lot of conversations and figuring out what's going on. If you take LSD and MDMA at substantial doses at the same time, the come-up is overwhelming. It causes nausea, anxiety, like it's just like a full, like 90 minutes of fairly unpleasant come-up qualia, and just not that good of a synergy, to be honest. So there's really two schools of thought. A is people who take MDMA first and kind of like kickstart the smoothing of the field of qualia and the relaxation response and kind of this prior of love for all sentient beings, and then they energize that with LSD. One problem there is, especially if you've taken MDMA a good number of times before and you have kindled that calm down, there could be trouble when you're coming down from MDMA and then you're still full on the LSD experience. That could be very unpleasant, and I've heard some pretty bad trips based on that. profound feelings of loneliness combined with a mystical state is not pleasant. Let's put it that way. But yeah, if you're taking a moderate, 100 milligrams of MDMA or something like that, and you very rarely take MDMA, that school of thought may actually work well because, yeah, the LSD kind of like keeps some of the empathogenic qualities going, and the landing can be pretty soft. And for a lot of people, actually, the main problem with LSD is the come-up anxiety. So, there's a class of people, a class of circumstances for which that approach may actually be pretty good. But by and large, the most common approach that I have heard about, seen described, and which tends to produce the most significant effects in a way, is when you first take the LSD, and actually a substantial dose of LSD, let's say like 150 to 200 micrograms, and then at around 3.5 hours to 4.5 hours in, kind of like within that period, then you take MDMA in the dose of, let's say, between 100 and 150 milligrams. And there, the idea that MDMA the idea that MDMA doesn't change the LSD state is ridiculous, right? If you have experienced that phase transition as you come up on MDMA in the middle of an LSD trip, it is a profound phase transition, right? It's like the way one of these psychonauts was describing it is like you experience all of the dukkha of the contractions from the LSD just kind of chasing their own tail and dissolving away as the MDMA kicks in. And radical phase transition that happens on those levels. Not guaranteed positive. In general, is very, very positive, but there are also some bad experiences that I've heard from people with candy flipping, especially in those dosages, which I might get into in a different video about kind of talking more deeply about specific like failure modes of different combinations. In that particular case, it was something involving actually philosophy, like unpleasant philosophical quote-unquote realizations that were felt very real in the moment, but are not intrinsically related to the change of the texture of the experience. It was more kind of like a processing a difficult philosophical thought or something like that was experienced as a kind of pretty deep bad trip of some sort. Okay, so there are, like, first of all, yeah, there's like those schools of thoughts, but then on top of that, the scales that are used to study psychedelic experiences are very poorly crafted because they focus on, generally speaking, semantic content. Things like oceanic dissolution, things that require some kind of semantic interpretation, some kind of like spiritual lens to make sense of. However, I actually think, as we've talked about, the nervous system as a nonlinear optical computer, that, yeah, when you're introducing these substances into the medium, you're actually doing you're causing actual electromagnetic changes in the tissue. Things such as increasing conductivity or increasing permittivity or increasing the nonlinear relationship between index of refraction and neural activity and various parameters like that. In which case, yeah, the kind of analytic framework that you need to put on this topic is more kind of like with a physics lens, right? It is, okay, in what ways are the waves of sensation changing the way in which they're traveling depending on the state? And there, for example, the scales that we were developing at QRI for really, be able to tell whether you're in a quote-unquote dissociative state, in an empathogenic state, or on a classic psychedelic 5-HT2A state, are things having to do with, hey, did you experience any kind of tracer effects? So like that, for example, is a very characteristic of any classic psychedelic, generalized tracers, right? Like sensations last longer, right? MDMA has much more to do with a softening of rough edges with some kind of very pleasant buzz. Stephen Lehart talked about that, and I'll mention that. I'll discuss that in a little bit more depth in a second. And then dissociatives, in the QRI paradigm, to a first approximation, the thing that they're doing is they're changing the properties of the medium of wave propagation such that the waves travel more slowly. And then everything else from it is kind of downstream from that. Like all of the crazy psychedelia that can happen in high-dose ketamine are downstream of the fact that ketamine is slowing down the speed of wave propagation across your nervous system. Or at least that would be like a very neat, elegant, simple, high-level explanation, gear level, high-level explanation that then essentially, catalyzes all of these other, subtle differences in complexity. So to kind of like go a little bit deeper, even better yet, right? Like then developing better scales to find differences between MDMA and LSD and their combination, and also, doing the right dosages in the appropriate time. Another thing is essentially, consulting with very advanced psychonauts, very, very smart people who have looked at their own experience for years and taken, lots and lots of notes and have been trying to develop a general theory of actually what is it that is going on. So one of the things I highlighted in Qualia Computing, it's an excerpt from The Grand Illusion by Stephen Lehar, is this explanation of how he made sense of candy flipping. The general idea for him was, hey, candy flipping is two pieces of the puzzle coming together and synergizing, where the first piece is MDMA causes these very, very pleasant medium frequency buzz, essentially, which, in the eyes might manifest as nystagmus. Nystagmus? I never know how to pronounce it. But essentially that is like that effect where the eyes are kind of like uncontrollably vibrating. Well, Stephen Lehar argues that that is happening in a much more generalized way. It's almost kind of like your nervous system has built some kind of electric potential of some sort, and then it gets frisky, and then it wiggles a little bit in order to relieve that potential. That wiggling and that friction, that causes lovely qualia. Very, very pleasant. Maybe indistinguishable from kind of love qualia more broadly. I think at a metaphysical, deep mystical level, it actually has something to do with love, essentially waves of awareness, kind of like the process of them syncing up and the process of them getting in phase. That might be phenomenal love at the deepest level. And so MDMA kind of like does your nervous system jitter in that very specific way, which is not very psychedelic at all. It's more, some kind of deep stress relief and relaxation that comes with that smoothens your field of awareness. Okay, so that is MDMA. LSD, on the other hand, he would actually describe it as it energizes your experience, and also it is like chopping off the high frequency components of a Fourier transform of your experience. In reality, I think it's not actually that. I think it's more like desynchronization of typical phase synchrony across the spectrum that generally is finely tuned. So here's the thing, like if you take a square and you take the 2D Fourier transform of it, and then you essentially only take the low frequencies, you will essentially it will look like kind of like an LSD cube, in that the square or the cube essentially will have these additional kind of like echoes around it, that the higher frequencies would essentially slowly cancel out. Now, you can get a similar effect if you actually still have the high frequencies, but they're out of phase. And so it is not that you're reducing the power in the high frequencies, it's more that by desynchronizing them, the low frequencies don't have the higher frequencies to cancel out those extra vibrations. And so essentially the contents of internal representations kind of like bleed into their environment. And so you get these echoes and tessellations and symmetrical texture repetition and vibes. You also get essentially internal phenomenal objects have their modes of vibration and resonance, and they're emitting those waves to their surrounding. So that's LSD. But here's the thing, it can be pretty sharp. Those very sharp, sometimes very detailed, beautiful crystalline patterns, if they're not harmonized with each other on LSD, they can actually be very dissonant. And, a very, very unpleasant experience that can happen on LSD or any deep, full psychedelic for that matter, is when, you can have two internally harmonized worldviews that are very self-consistent across the, hierarchy of abstraction, that are competing with each other, and they're equally powerful. very classic, I suspect, in our culture, for example, would be, for example, like the process of deconversion. Like, hey, you were like, you know, deep Christian or something. You actually believed in the Bible or something like that. And then also you learned about Richard Dawkins, right? You read The Selfish Gene or something. Well, for a while, there's going to be parts of you who are still clinging on to the Christian view. There are parts of you that are resisting the atheist view, and vice versa. And yeah, on a psychedelic experience, these two things could actually ultimately end up in an existential fight for your soul, as it were. And that can be extremely unpleasant. Essentially, that would be kind of like neural annealing gone wrong, where like what the thing that you're annealing is actually the conflict between these worldviews. It's not recommended. I don't think of it as a rite of passage or anything like that. It does happen. It's relatively common, but if you can avoid it, I would much prefer you did. So MDMA, when taken the right time, in the right dose, in the right circumstances, is very likely to prevent that sort of thing from happening, because by adding these kind of like blur, these very pleasant, euphoric, frisky, vibratory blur on top of your experience, it will soften the hard edges of the experience. And as such, it essentially makes the harmonization gradient be fully universal. In other words, you're not going to have patches of coherence here trying to harmonize with themselves, having trouble harmonizing with the whole, patches over here doing the same thing, and then a conflict arising. It's much more that every single pattern will try to harmonize with the background field, which is vibrating homogeneously across the entire field of awareness. As a consequence, by the time the building blocks essentially are large enough, they're already pre-harmonized because they've been harmonizing with the background field. And so they will click into place, just no problem. There's this sense of, oneness and reconciliation that, can be really powerful and very reliable if done right. So that is how I'd expect an even more serious kind of like research direction, for understanding candy flipping is, hey, how can we measure, quantify, identify these, euphoric buzzing that happens on MDMA, and how can we measure, quantify, and optimize the tracer effect and essentially the chopping off of the high frequencies in the Fourier spectrum of LSD, so that you can put those things together. Well, I think actually you can do a lot more than that. So now we're going to actually talk about phase diagrams and then the even deeper paradigm of qualia lensing. So phase diagrams is, once you start recognizing and thinking of the states of consciousness quite a bit as like phases of matter, actually as like phases of the electromagnetic field and its interactions with matter, it is very natural to come up with something like phase diagrams for states of consciousness as a function of, for example, concentration of two different drugs. In the same way as there are phase diagrams for matter as a function of, for example, temperature and pressure. And so the thumbnail image that you made was, that you you clicked into to see this video was made by Cube Flipper. And in this case, is kind of like something that came out of a deep conversation at Phenomenology Club, but we're trying to catalog, okay, like what is the state space of things that can happen on candy flipping? Now, this is a first draft, there's so much that can be improved on this phase diagram. I don't even mention like the relative timing of those two substances. Actually, the phase diagram corresponds mostly to if they're timed properly. And by that, I mean, generally speaking, LSD first, and then somewhere in the first third of the experience taking MDMA, and then taking a snapshot at the peak of those effects. So I'm not even, categorizing the entire trajectory or anything of the sort. Really, the state space is actually much more complicated, especially if you get into kind of like optimized candy flipping, where you don't take the doses all at once, but you stagger them in an intelligent way. So all of those caveats, but, roughly speaking, there does seem to be kind of like clusters of possible things that might happen as a function of the concentration of these two substances. So, first of all, if you don't take enough of either, let's say below 30 micrograms of LSD and below 30 milligrams of MDMA, it's just not enough to catalyze a phase transition. And so you might experience kind of a microdose level you might feel stimulated, maybe like drinking 1 or 2 cups of coffee. Like things like that might happen. It might relax you a little bit, but it's not going to be something to write home about. Now, here's the thing. If you actually start increasing the dose of LSD, the threshold at which MDMA actually seems to have like any noticeable effect will actually start to increase. This is why kind of like the lower region, LSD from like 30 micrograms to up to like 200 micrograms, the dose of MDMA to actually start noticing any effect from the MDMA increases. The way I interpret this is that MDMA causes this deep relaxation response, whereas LSD causes a relaxation and a stimulation response. It's kind of like LSD actually kind of like creates this flickering effect between relaxation and contraction and expansion that is a very mixed state, right? So what happens is that if you don't have enough MDMA for kind of the relaxation waves to propagate, then the LSD dynamic will just dominate. And as an effect, what you may experience is the feeling of the glow of MDMA way in the background. But the state is still primarily LSD. So I think, yeah, in many cases, somebody might say, like, hey, I tried candy flipping, but it just felt like LSD. Like, I didn't really see a point. I think in most cases, it's because they just took too much LSD and not enough MDMA. Whatever. They had like a weak peel or something like that, and the tabs were strong or whatever. And that actually can be fairly fragile in the lower levels of MDMA, meaning that it's very interesting, I think, that it seems like, again, all of these super preliminary, and don't take it obviously as medical advice or as like, any kind of deep truth. Right now, this is all super preliminary. But let's say that 30 milligrams of MDMA and 30 micrograms of LSD taken at once for a few hours will produce a completely novel phase of consciousness that is different than MDMA, it is different than LSD. Whereas if you had taken 50 micrograms of LSD, but still 30 milligrams of MDMA, that may break that down, and it will be just a primarily LSD experience. Does that make sense? In other words, the actual candy flipping synergy is somewhat fragile to more LSD. They need to be properly balanced. It's kind of like making a perfume again. Yeah, if you add too much vanilla, then I don't know, the mint effect actually goes away, or like just doesn't matter. It's just way in the background. It doesn't have the synergy. On the flip side, then you have the whole column where you took too much MDMA relative to LSD. And so that also has a little bit of that effect where, yeah, higher doses of MDMA may kind of like wash away and just dominate over like small doses of LSD. And it's almost as if you didn't take LSD. Like it may feel like, hey, the LSD is just too much in the background. So a combination like that would be, for example, yeah, like 30 micrograms of LSD and 100 milligrams of MDMA. The LSD may just not show up very much. Okay, so those are kind of, yeah, in some sense, the trivial cases. Now there is one, blob, one region in the state space, somewhat fragile. It roughly goes from like, 50 micrograms LSD to 120, and from like 30 to 40 milligrams of MDMA all the way to like 75 or 80. Like there's kind of like that blob in the center of the state space, which the name in Phenomenology Club is affectionately referred to as Magical Vision Land. So Magical Vision Land is kind of the empathogenic equivalent of a free-willing hallucination. Those states of consciousness where you can say, give me a table, and a table appears in front of you, and it's kind of like a lucid dream, and you can play with it. Yeah, the right combination of MDMA and LSD can produce something that is quite similar to that, except that the texture is all universally pleasant and soft. So it's not like you can actually imagine anything. There's like some limits, precisely because there's this kind of an inbuilt security measure that the building blocks themselves are very harmonious and very beautiful. Then if you increase LSD a little bit more, but you keep MDMA in that range, then you get these like, yeah, other place that is like actually quite depersonalized, but it has some waves of bliss. It is kind of like LSD depersonalization, but more pleasant. But still, the MDMA is just not enough to actually get your ego to click into place. And so you would be, psychologically mostly in an LSD state, but notably with MDMA would essentially make it more pleasant, and more unified. There's like a sense of unification. Then there's like the whole turbulence zone, which is kind of, these weird, I guess, region. And turbulence, so here's where like, very clear, strange nonlinearity effects happen. Where like, the LSD and the MDMA combination is doing something that is legitimately really, really different than the sum of their parts. But it's unstable. And I think like, for a lot of people who get there, they might think, this is it. This is candy flipping. And it's very pleasant and all over the place, but it's very unstable and chaotic and doesn't really settle on anything. It's almost kind of, there's enough LSD to create these contractions and expansion dynamic enveloped in enough MDMA to essentially continuously soften it. So it's almost kind of the LSD is constantly trying to contract you in various ways, and the MDMA is constantly trying to open you up. But it does neither fully. And so it's a turbulent state. And then finally, in the upper ranges, when you're talking about, like 200 micrograms of LSD and 150 milligrams of MDMA, then there's a final, as far as I know, I don't know what happens at higher doses. I know one person whose favorite combo is 500 micrograms of LSD and 200 milligrams of MDMA. But I still, haven't done a deep enough interview with them about exactly what that does. But I suspect it's probably that phase. Either way, probably the minimum for that phase is 150 milligrams of MDMA and like 200 of LSD, and around that region in the phase diagram. Then you get a legitimately new phase transition, which is the one that I think is the really significant one. This is the earth-shattering, non-dual awareness, blissful state. It is much more balanced and beautiful than just a very good pure LSD experience, because there's this feeling of wholeness. It can happen on high dose LSD, let's say 500 micrograms in some periods of the experience. But pure LSD will generally have a lot of rough edges and turbulence and be chaotic in all sorts of ways. But that phase transition, again, like in that, the upper diagonal corner, upper right corner is on a different level. I mean, it's on a different level of completion, a sense of this is a complete experience all at once, completely wholesome and whole. Very profound, very, very profound. And it makes you feel fully rejuvenated, almost kind of, when it's a good experience, almost kind of like meeting God in a way. And I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by that. This very fun character from Toy Story 4 comes to mind. You should Google or see a few videos. It's Forky. So the story of Forky is, it's just kind of a minimal toy, right? Like a minimal viable toy where like a girl, the protagonist in that movie, well, I guess one of the main characters of that movie, was essentially just making a toy out of like common objects and, a tiny plastic spoon and some pipe cleaning wire, and like, a couple eyes. And it's enough of a character that the reification process kind of like clicks into place, but is enough of a non-character that it actually feels at the edge between self and non-self, right? So, and all it wants is to dissolve back into being, right? It doesn't actually want to be a character. That high-end LSD MDMA state, candy flipping gone right, it is essentially something along the lines of feeling like a pure, beautiful wave of energy that is maybe made of the exact same thing as God, as ultimate consciousness. And it's just like temporarily segmented out of the universal field through some kind of topological trick or some kind of optical illusion or something like that. But like this sense of profound unity with the mystical body of the divine, that is very, very present there. And it can be very life-changing. Now, you can go even deeper, and you can do it perhaps in a more reliable and a lot less taxing way if you know what you're doing, which is what I'm going to get to. Now, even beyond the phase diagrams, I would say the next level would actually be, essentially the Manhattan Project of Consciousness, or kind of the World Awakening Project or something like that, where, you actually gather teams of extremely advanced psychonauts, meditators, physicists, visual artists, and together they actually try to reverse engineer the physics of these various phase transitions. I'm very hopeful within a few years we're going to be at that stage. But once you start thinking about it, that's, light years of improvement relative to, giving people a mystical experiences questionnaire and imagining that will actually tell you what the difference between these states of consciousness is, which is, definitely not the way. In particular, the high-end paradigm that I think is going to be very, very promising here is precisely that of qualia lensing, which I talked about in the video on the Manhattan Project of Consciousness, where one of the key innovations for developing the atomic bomb essentially was how to create explosive lenses where the shock wave essentially converges and implodes as a sphere, as opposed to just a bunch of outer circles. And so how to compress, a piece of matter in a very, very homogeneous way with tremendous, tremendous energy. Essentially, I think like a really positive non-dual awareness, candy flipping experience is doing something along those lines, where as I was telling, right, I was saying something like MDMA might change the wave propagation dynamics within your nervous system, where something like LSD is primarily, but not only, primarily energizing, right? So it's almost kind of like you're changing the index of refraction of the material, and then on top of that, you're energizing it. And so you can actually focus waves in a coherent way. But there's even more to that. And I'm going to explain in a second. Before I go there, there's still one more thing to mention, which is, okay, if you do have the ability to kind of use other substances, how would you actually make an even better candy flipping experience? So there's some incremental improvements that can be done. So again, maybe the minimal viable kind of like synergy between MDMA and LSD would be something in the range of 30 milligrams of MDMA and 30 micrograms of LSD for a typical person in an empty stomach. But even better than that is, let's say after 3 hours, then you take also 10 milligrams of 2CB, and that keeps the empathogenic quality of the MDMA going. It also, reported by a bunch of people, not something that, we can confirm scientifically at this point in time, but it really does seem to be the case that taking a little bit of 2CB before the come down from MDMA actually extends the MDMA feelings and significantly reduces the come down. Might be kind of like a net positive there. Of course it's going to increase your, the cardiac loading, and I'm sure it's not good for you at a physiological level, but in terms of hedonic optimization, I think it's, kind of like the direction to move towards. And then also actually the role of something like THC. THC has also a little bit of a non-linear effect with psychedelics. And if the thing that you're essentially non-linearly energizing with THC, or energizing from a different angle, adding a little bit of a reverb of a different kind, of a tracer of a different kind, increasing the interconnectivity and integration. Let's say like 5 to 10 milligrams of THC at the 3 to 4 hour mark. So, okay, like a minimum viable, optimized, full day, beautiful candy flipping experience would be, 30 milligrams MDMA, 30 micrograms LSD, 3 hours later, 10 milligrams of 2CB, and half an hour later, let's say 5 to 10 milligrams of THC. That will be a relatively, not very taxing. It's not going to be very taxing to the body because of the relatively low doses, especially of MDMA, which is the main culprit there. And it doesn't have much of a calm down, and it's psychologically manageable because it's not all that psychedelic. And it will last, a good 8-9 hours, like the actual kind of like synergy. These, again, by the way, might not work if you've taken MDMA a bunch of times in the past. But, if you've taken MDMA less than, let's say, 20 times, and you haven't taken it in 1 or 2 years, yeah, these might actually be quite a significant synergy. If you have taken MDMA many times before, probably you might need to double the dose or something to actually feel it. That's just fact of life. And again, why you've got to be very careful about how you use MDMA, because the magic does get lost forever after a certain number of times that you've taken it, for a percentage of people. Okay, so what I'm going to say now is the way to think about this is hone in on the qualia of love. I was talking about how MDMA makes you feel kind of like frisky because it makes it vibrate in a certain way, and at the interface you get this kind of attempt at phase synchronization, and that there's a very beautiful, warm, soft effect that happens there. Well, that effect also happens with other substances. For example, GHB. And GHB, even though it's a depressant, its pharmacology is pretty complex, and it is generally described as like very aphrodisiac, right? Like GHB is kind of like can be a very, very intimate thing, like has empathogenic qualities for sure. It's probably not as bad for you as MDMA. Big caveat is that it's easy to die on GHB, because if you take double or triple a significant dose, it can just kill you, right? So we've got to be extremely careful with that. I wouldn't recommend it to most people, because I don't think most people are responsible enough to actually explore these things safely. Now, scientific research is a different matter. Now, of course, if you have a bunch of doctors around you, you're doing it in an ideal environment, then probably it can be a fairly safe thing to do. But yeah, in the hand of the average party goer, I wouldn't trust them. Sorry. But yeah, so GHB also kind of like has that effect. But really, there's something even more general. Oh, and as I was saying, yeah, ketamine and nitrous oxide has kind of these like slowing down of waves effect. There's another key possible ingredient here. Again, very dangerous, especially in combination with other things. But something like pregabalin. It seems to have kind of like the right level of deep relaxation response that can also be a key ingredient in one of these kind of like optimizations of the candy flipping state. So essentially what we're getting at is that what you want is for kind of the creation of these kind of like hedonium, like kind of like what is the current best recipe for hedonium? Well, essentially anything that combines the following three things. So first of all, you need some kind of energizer, something that will dramatically increase the energy of your nervous system, of your field of consciousness. And again, here I would refer you to the Hamiltonian of consciousness, where essentially you can quantify what is the total energy of a moment of experience by adding up the energy in each of the fields of experience, each of the channels of experience. And the contributors of energy are things such as brightness, movement, acceleration, tension, intensity, the feeling of relaxation. Any of those things add up to the current level of energy. And essentially you can energize pretty much anything. I've also talked about in the guided meditation about playing with the energy parameter, or like any content about neural annealing, or more recently neural field annealing. Essentially, yeah, there's many ways of increasing energy, whether it is through sensory input, like hot and cold showers, or, breath work, like Wim Hof breathing, or things like high intensity interval training. All of those are kind of in that category. But really, the super freaking efficient ones are things like DMT. Like DMT is a powerful energizer, especially of the higher frequencies. And sometimes, that energy can get stuck in the high frequencies, especially if you take DMT on a normal, sober, maybe somewhat irritated state of mind. then actually the energy gets trapped in these lower dimensional representations, whether they're like planes or the surface of your skin or your modeling of organs or things like that. So, it can energize in a very, very, very generic, broad spectrum way. And that's what we want. We do not want, for example, narrow spectrum energizers. For example, typical stimulants like amphetamine or cocaine or things like that. That is not going to work for this effect. Why? Because that type of energization, well, first of all, it comes with a lot of muscle tension, which is kind of really something that we're trying to avoid as much as possible here. And then on top of that, it's just very narrow. Like you don't get, for example, the energization of the low frequencies with something like cocaine. The energy is trapped and stuck in the higher frequencies. Whereas, DMT, in a very relaxed state of mind, the energy starts in the high frequencies, but slowly percolates downwards. Also partly because of cross-frequency coupling, which is one of the generic effects of psychedelics. You need an energizer for this recipe. Can be LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, 2CB, psychedelics in general. But there's like some, DMT is probably the best for some of these combinations because of how clean it is in energizing effect. The second ingredient is you need also something to increase interconnectivity or integration. And I think like cannabis very generically will help there, but also something like 2CB. So 2CB is both, an energizer as well as something that increases interconnectivity. And then third, very key ingredient, you need something that will induce whole body deep relaxation response. So when you have those three elements together, properly balanced, there is some deep synergy that happens. And this is profound. I mean, the first hint I ever, had of anything of this sort being significant was a friend of mine in grad school, actually, who he was definitely a psychedelic user, and he was particularly interested in research chemicals like, what is it, like 5-MeO, MIPT, or 4-HO, MET, and he was all into, understanding the subtle differences between them and so on. And he had quite a bit of experience all across the board with a bunch of different substances. And I asked him, what is the best that you have ever felt? And, he had even tried opioids and I think like stimulants in general. I think he was pretty experienced across the board. I don't think, not necessarily the most responsible guy in the world, but he wasn't particularly reckless either. But essentially he said, LSD and nitrous oxide, man. LSD and nitrous oxide, man. He was saying like he just feels so good on that combination that every time he's taken it, as he's calming down, different very beautiful things that have happened in his life kind of like click into place, and he can put them on a scale. So do you remember the logarithmic scales of pleasure and pain? How, that article has like this scale of the pleasure levels, and how they grow non-linearly. Actually, they grow exponentially as you go up the scale. Yeah, I mean, essentially, if you have one of these 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 experiences and you're coming down from it, you can realize like, oh, the day of my marriage, there was one fleeting feeling where I felt so at peace in the world. And that slice of qualia is something that, boom, you're just like revisiting for, let's say, 10 seconds as you're coming down. And then he's like, oh, the day I got a promotion. Oh my God, okay, there's something there. And then like, oh, that wonderful orgasm that I had in, freshman year of college or something like that. And it's like, and you can put them on a scale by comparing with that extremely positive valence that you're experiencing. So what on earth, what is special about LSD and nitrous oxide, right? Since then I have reported this a bunch of times. A lot of people say, yeah, like you've got to know what that feels like. But don't do it, like when it becomes really powerful. This is also something that Stephen Lehart talks about is, let's say like 2 to 3 hits of LSD. And then nitrous oxide. Bam, that can do the trick. The phenomenology of that is like you relax so deeply, your being opens up. It's as if all of these kind of resonant cavities deep in your soul open up one by one. And then the LSD energy, once they're fully opened, compresses them and energizes them. And so you have all of these smooth, perfectly symmetrical cavities producing their own resonant modes. And then you have this fusion process where the cavities are going to try to harmonize with each other. And as they harmonize with each other, something kind of builds up and cooks up, and then there's a phase transition that leads to those moments of powerful, blissful, non-dual awareness. And it's oftentimes extremely profound, and you are likely to forget who you are or what you're doing, how you got there. Yeah, and if it happened properly, in a good euphoric way, it will very likely, reset your conception of just how good you can feel. So this principle is very general, right? So energization, increasing connectivity, and the relaxation response. In the case I was just describing, the nitrous oxide was kind of essential for that relaxation response. That said, I mean, there is this additional complexity that I think, like nitrous oxide and ketamine and dissociatives more broadly, the relaxation response is kind of idiosyncratic because it relies on these waves moving more slowly. But you don't really need the waves to move more slowly for the kind of synergy that I'm talking about, for fusion at the end of the day. And actually, fusion is a particular technical acronym that I'm going to be talking a lot more about in future research and videos. The acronym is Field Unification, Search and Simplify in Invariant Optical Networks, which is, I think, is the kind of hardware that the nervous system is. So anyway, there's much more to talk about fusion, but you don't actually need the waves to move more slowly. You just need kind of this deep relaxation response. And so among the things that can produce the deep relaxation response, ketamine and nitrous oxide would be two examples that go through the dissociative route of slowing the speed of wave propagation. Then you have something like pregabalin. I think it works quite differently. It's maybe much more of a direct relaxant. I think maybe it might also have like some wave effects. I don't know, but I don't know if that's necessary. GHB also. GHB, super addictive, super dangerous in general. So you've got to be very careful with it. Don't double dose or anything like that. That's just stupid in the case of that drug. In general, actually, just don't do GHB because it's not very safe. But I mean, one of the ways in which you can get these deep mystical experience response in an incredibly blissful, euphoric way that agrees with neural annealing and the symmetry theory of valence, originally introduced by Mike in Principia Qualia, but then developed at QRI. That sort of thing. Something like, for example, 3 milliliters of GHB combined with 10 to 15 milligrams of 2CB. And then at the peak of that combination, actually first the 2CB and then like an hour later the GHB so that the peaks coincide. And then during the peak, you will have like a solid approximately like 2 hours where if you introduce DMT, it will do the thing where essentially, you've opened up, you've relaxed so deeply with the GHB, then the 2CB is kind of increasing the impedance matching between these resonant cavities, which is already a very blissful state, that pairing. And then the DMT energizes it. And then you get this fusion effect between these resonant cavities. And much, much higher dimensional phenomenal spaces as you get, kind of the cross product of these resonant cavities. Their quantum superposition, I don't know. There's something deeply physical, deeply profound that is happening there. that it does give you, yeah, this sense of, oh my goodness, consciousness is both a particle and a wave at the same time. But actually, it is a third thing that is much more difficult to describe. But you can't see both properties simultaneously being expressed in that hybrid state. So yeah, so this kind of gives you like a general template, right? So, well, and then in addition, you also want to make sure that the qualia lensing effects are properly tuned, right? So, for example, timing can be really important. I don't think, kind of a peak candy flipping like experience can happen. There's some people who say, for example, hey, take MDMA, and then at the very tail end, 7 hours later, take 2CB or something. Like, yeah, by then the synergy is not going to really work. I also don't think, for example, that like adding nitrous oxide in the calm down of an MDMA is a good idea. Because even though the MDMA will have that relaxation response and the nitrous oxide will also, because the MDMA calm down itself produces like feelings of loneliness and negative qualia, that could be the thing that gets amplified and annealed into your nervous system. So yeah, it's a pretty delicate thing. And actually, I think, for the making of the Love Bomb, for the World Awakening project, we want precision engineering, right? Like we want to find a combination, a set of tools and techniques that 99.9% of the cases produces a +4, a full mystical experience in the deepest level possible with no risk of bad trip and no risk of, respiratory depression or extremely low risk of heart attack or blood clots. Essentially, we want to make this super optimized. And I'm very serious in thinking that this completely is a game changer for team consciousness. That if we can make these things available on a daily basis with close to no side effects, yeah, that changes the game theory of reality in a drastic way, very, very drastic way. So I think, yeah, to kind of wrap up and conclude, just to remind you, the core idea is you need, first of all, something that will deeply relax the deepest parts of your soul. Might, of course, be related to muscle relaxation, might, of course, be related to vascular relaxation, might be related as well with local field annealing. Like there's lots of implementation level details, but I'm talking about, the particular qualia of the relaxation response. Intuitively, the way to think about it is that a lot of our, the texture of our experience is essentially the synergy between these resonant cavities. And usually they're kind of misshaped. They're somewhat tensed. And whenever a wave of energy is traveling within them, it doesn't bounce symmetrically. And so it converges at the center in an out of phase way. I would recommend looking into Cube Flippers and Scry's explanation of Stephen Lehar's abstraction and reification model. This will give you some idea of actually, kind of like what I'm talking about. And when you relax it so deeply, there's a phase transition there where it's kind of like the walls of the cavity can now fire in synchrony. And as they fire in synchrony, they create this very harmonious, very smooth standing wave pattern. And so you need that very clean relaxation response so that the building blocks, the resonators that are contributing to the base frequencies of your consciousness are all highly, highly self-tuned. Then you need something to increase the interconnectivity. Sometimes cannabis might be just good enough, but there's other things in that category that will increase kind of the impedance matching between each of these resonant cavities. And then you need something to energize the whole system in a clean, cross-frequency coupled way so that you actually have these, what I'm going to call fusion happen, where all of these resonant cavities actually harmonize with each other and you get something like their cross product, which feels like a superposition of all those resonances at once in perfect harmony. And that's essentially indistinguishable from a full-on mystical experience. So, yeah, I mean, to kind of like wrap up, I mean, like when I talk about a full-on mystical experience here, I'm not just talking about like super high levels of bliss, bodily pleasure. I'm not talking about intense psychedelia. I am talking about essentially the deep stuff that Buddhism is getting at, the thing that 5-MeO DMT gets at, the thing that sometimes very high dose LSD gets at. But I think it's perhaps even much more reliable for it to happen with some of these combinations. Again, like one that I would highlight as potentially extremely reliable might be 2CB plus GHB plus DMT. It's almost kind of like it smooths out your field of consciousness so much before the energization happens that there's just no rough edges to navigate or figure out how to cancel out. So it's just perhaps psychologically extremely safe. And in particular, that these causes these blissful non-dual awareness, where, in the words of Shenzhen Young, essentially he would say that if you can perceive a sensation fully without flinching along the way, that is going to reorient your relationship, your approach, your attitude towards experience more generally. It is as if the illusion of duality within our world simulation happens because whenever a sensation comes, we sort of like very quickly flinch or contract along the way in such a way that it partitions the pseudo-time arrow, it partitions your sense of time into clusters of sensations where some of those sensations are associated with yourself and some are associated with another. And that causes a kind of intrinsic existential pain, the pain of duality. Ultimately, I think it's a valence effect, but it does make sense at a semantic level to think that, okay, yeah, all of these talk about the self being at the core of our suffering. The self as an attentional trick that is causing a flinching response and partitioning of your field of attention over phenomenal time that creates a duality. Yeah, so any of these things that I'm talking about, a successful candy flipping experience, a successful LSD plus 2CB plus nitrous oxide, or a successful, ketamine and MDMA and LSD, or, any of those pairings will produce these type of attentional mode where you can experience a sensation fully from start to finish. And that makes them so much higher valence, but B, it has this additional effect of reorienting your approach to experience, where you notice that the pain of duality comes from this kind of attentional flinching. And when you're doing that over and over, I think essentially the chains of dependent origination that Buddhists talk about, and all the kind of like the dukkha construction that is generated by kind of the inherent duality of our perception, of our normal everyday perception, all of that becomes pretty evident. And so you realize that, okay, like looking for salvation in a picture, looking for salvation in a person, or looking for salvation in food, whatever it may be, they're all fleeting pleasures, and they feel fully satisfying and fully like they're gonna do the trick to make things right because you're not perceiving them fully. And so you're not really noticing their impermanence and their lack of self and the lack of satisfaction that they produce. It doesn't mean that when you perceive those attributes, you're going to feel suffering. Actually, kind of on the contrary. Now, the transition can be extremely unpleasant for a lot of people in a lot of circumstances. But what these may potentially allow us to do is to experience this alternative way of perceiving sensations that doesn't come with duality, and it doesn't come with clinging, and it doesn't come with, the illusion of a self, or the illusion of permanence, or the illusion of satisfaction. And so, it might produce a depth of relief that is unparalleled. It's not going to be, it's going to be way better, actually. It's enlightenment qualia. Enlightenment qualia is way better than the heaven worlds, way better than the best orgasm. It's something so much deeper. And so, for example, if you just take high-dose MDMA and have a wonderful time, it's actually still unlikely that you will have like that type of enlightenment qualia. Like it's kind of unlikely. You need the full package to experience that. And to conclude, what I will say is that I think 5-MeO DMT is still probably the most promising single substance out there, because it produces this enlightenment qualia, this full release and fusion effect. But I think it could probably still be optimized. I mean, there are some trip reports of, for example, people combining nitrous oxide with 5-MeO-DMT, and they actually described it as an improvement. It enhances the bliss of the 5-MeO-DMT. So my current understanding is that 5-MeO-DMT just kind of happens to have those three effects at once. Again, like the deep relaxation response, the energization effect, and the interconnectivity. But I'm sure it can still be optimized. And sometimes you can have very bad 5-MeO-DMT experiences, I think, because especially during takeoff, it can have like some rough elements and some rough texture. And if you focus your attention on that quality, rather than using equanimity to just recenter on the bliss and just let the suffering go, if you're focusing or get caught up in the suffering, then you can amplify that, and then you end up in an extremely negative, hellish type experience. So yeah, 5-MeO-DMT can be pretty tricky. I actually think it can be pretty psychologically safe if you take it very slowly and you gain confidence in it through like a series of small doses, slowly building up towards the full release. But yeah, in practice, a lot of people just, they're just going to have one big 5-MeO-DMT dose. And yeah, that can be deeply traumatizing. So my current idea is that, yeah, there's nothing like, 5-MeO-DMT is a catalyst for these full, deep mystical experiences. But it can be improved upon. And making a gears level model for what this full release state is will ultimately take us even further. However, studying 5-MeO-DMT is going to be a stepping stone for sure. And essentially, yeah, having the full World Awakening Project or Manhattan Project of Consciousness, taking a very close look at 5-MeO-DMT is going to be really important. So there's that. Well, I think that's about it. I think I covered it all. I think maybe the one thing I didn't cover is that even without the utterly mind-blowing kind of enlightenment qualia that happens in some of the upper ranges of these combinations, even relatively low levels of these combinations, for example, the 30 milligrams MDMA and 30 micrograms LSD combination that I was talking about, even that combined with meditation can still be very transformative, because it allows you to do very, very deep kind of like suffering relieving perceptual changes, and such as de-reifying your suffering, where the suffering itself doesn't get concentrated and doesn't get reified. So you might still have kind of the somewhat unpleasant sensations, but you're not judging them anymore because they're not actually coupling together. And witnessing that in that state might potentially give you a North Star for where to aim just pure meditation. And I suspect, yeah, that is extremely valuable on its own. So I wouldn't be surprised if like, yeah, these very moderate, low to moderate doses for these combinations combined with a meditation retreat might themselves also be profoundly, profoundly beneficial. Yeah, I guess the last thing that I will mention is that, yeah, I think like just psychedelics on their own, especially if you don't start out deeply relaxed, can actually be very counterproductive. Because again, like what, something like LSD or psilocybin are going to be doing is like, yeah, they're actually doing this very quick interplay between contraction and expansion, kind of like tensing and releasing. And the balance actually depends on your mood and your state of consciousness and what information you're processing. So you can sometimes take psilocybin and end up in a much more stressed state. It's not super common, but it does happen, right? So I do think there's some people who you could describe as like psychedelic maximalists who will say like, no, just go all the way on LSD, just go all the way on mushrooms or something like that. But I'm not convinced. I mean, there are glimpses of this non-dual awareness in those states, but they're difficult to stabilize. And even very, very deep practitioners like Christopher Bash, who wrote LSD and the Mind of the Universe, which is about documenting his like 70 plus high dose LSD experiences, an average of like 500 microgram dose experiences. Well, he would go through hell pretty much in every experience for at least like 2-3 hours and then bounce back into super heavenly experiences. I interpret it as kind of a strange annealing process. Maybe it is net positive, but it really did sound very, very negative. The way he describes it, like really, really very serious suffering that he was undergoing in every experience. And I don't know, I mean, unless you have some very particular idiosyncratic theory of consciousness where that suffering is actually necessary, I think it's kind of, I think it's not necessarily, thinking very clearly about actually what these qualia dynamics are and what the potential for super happiness actually lies. So yeah, my sense is that probably psychedelic maximalists might even anneal this ideology of mixed experiences as inherently necessary. I'm not convinced at all. I think that if we can have like a relatively non-addictive, relatively safe way of catalyzing these +4 full mystical experiences in a perfectly blissful way, that just might be strictly better than very high doses of a particular psychedelic. I really don't see a reason why to come back to those if you actually have an alternative. And so I do expect a big phase transition there, as we all realize that. And with that, infinite bliss, everybody. I'm very expectant of the phase transitions in consciousness as we continue to unravel the deep mystery of reality. So see you soon. And until then, infinite bliss. Take care, everybody. Ciao.